A while ago I put together this mini aquarium, sparking an ecosystem that very quickly spun out of control. It took me months to slowly stabilise it by building up a unique cast of tiny creatures one by one. And this video follows the whole process through from setting up the environment to finally leaving it to go on existing without me. The population in my fish tank had exploded, with baby guppies and baby shrimp everywhere. And they were all lost under a jungle of plants, so I had no idea how many there actually were. So it was time to set up a new home for the overflowing population. Lucky for me, there was a free tank lying on the side of the road near where I live. So between the free babies and the free tank, this project ended up being really low cost. I had to clean the tank a little bit before it was ready for scaping, but that was just half an hour with a sponge and some glass cleaning powder. Oh, and there was a bit of scraping as well. Whoever had it before me must have had a fake background on it, so I tried to scrape it off, but ended up just wiping it with acetone in the end. The tank's about 16 litres, which is on the small side, so I couldn't really do anything crazy with it. And at this point I didn't know exactly how I wanted it to look. I did have an old shelf lying around that I never got around to putting up, so I just cut it in half and turned it into a base for the tank. Yes, I did completely have the wrong kind of saw for the job, but besides it being embarrassing, it turned out fine. I cut a foam pad to size, which I didn't actually need, just like the wooden base, because I was just going to put it on a flat surface anyway. It was kind of dumb, but I didn't really know what I was doing. I was just kind of figuring things out for the first time. It looks alright for a little second-hand tank, so I filled it with water and left it overnight to check for leaks. If it held water, it'd hold fish, so I drained it and let it dry. Then, to escape the thing, I got some landscape foam because I wanted to try it on a small scale before using it on a bigger project. I decided just to create a slope at first, but really overshot the amount that I needed. So when it had cured 4 hours later, it was massive. A massive waste of foam. But I was happy to make the mistake then rather than on an expensive project. I chopped the excess off the top, which didn't take so long really. Then I got a knife and kind of started carving out a tunnel that goes all the way through. The idea was for the shrimp to have a place to hide or get around the tank in secret, and I'd still be able to watch them from the side. Whoa. I cut out some space around the entrances and glued rocks so everything looked more natural when it was covered in dirt and plants. It would have been nice to make the whole thing out of rocks instead of foam, but it'd be difficult to stop the dirt falling through into the tunnel, and it'd be expensive as well. So, I don't know, I was happy with it. After the basic structure was done, it didn't take long to set up the substrate. I poured sand into the lowest section at first because I didn't want it overtaken by plants straight away. It's nice working with a tank this small because I could just pick it up and wave it around to get sand in the tunnel. Took some regular topsoil and sieved out the big pieces to leave a bed of dirt for the plants to grow in. I just kind of poured it all over the top area, keeping it between the two different entrances so it doesn't kind of dirty the sand. I covered all the dirt with some gravel as well, just to hold it down, and tied it up a little bit with I don't know what this thing is. Adding plants was easy. I just filled the water up a little bit so they wouldn't die, and then I stuck them in the gravel. I'm not good at aquascaping, so chopping up some driftwood and just laying it on top of everything was the best I could do. I took some clumps of Java moss and just kind of stuck them all over the branches. After that, I just took some frog bit and dumped it on the surface. Oh, I had to put this rock there as well, because otherwise the branches would just float up off the bottom. I got this really cheap USB light, I think it was like £4 or something. And then pretty much the last thing I did was put a heater in it. This is what it all looked like when it was done, so I just left it alone and let it all grow in. The floating plants had covered the tank, and they'd started flowering at the surface as well. I didn't realise the roots would get so out of control, or I did, and I thought it would be cool, I don't remember. Since they'd broken through the gravel, they didn't have to rely on nutrients from the water column anymore. You can see exactly where they penetrated the soil, and I was worried that they'd break through the foam into the cave as well. Because they covered the surface, they had a monopoly on access to light, so unfortunately they had to go. The roots had weaved their way into everything, which meant I had to pull them out very slowly, very carefully, and one by one. It was a mess, but I could just put them in another tank, and I learned my lesson. Don't put frog bait in small tanks. I added some red root floaters instead because I know they've got short roots. I also picked out a handful of the brightest yellow shrimp I could find from the main tank. The best thing about shrimp is that when you put them in a new environment, they just immediately resume life like nothing ever happened. They don't even care how ugly the tank is, they just get to work cleaning up the mulchy stuff. Watching the shrimp up close, I noticed these other little dudes crawling around on the wood and on the plants. They're called ostracods, but they're also known as sea shrimp. They're kind of tiny crustacean that eats decaying stuff in a tank, so in my case it'd be the driftwood and the roots of the frog bit that snapped off when I was trying to pull it out. Anyway, it was very nice of them to clean up the tank for me. They're only doing good for the aquarium, and I read that the population would stay in check as long as you didn't overfeed the tank. Two months had passed and the mosses and floating plants had grown in. The ostracods had also spread to every corner of the tank. I never added food of any kind to the system, which means the shrimp and ostracods were thriving entirely on biofilm and decaying stuff. The floating plants had absolutely covered the surface and the shrimp were loving it. And while filming the ostracods, I spotted a single baby shrimp in the canopy. But I lost sight of him for a second and he just vanished into another dimension. After a while I figured out a little tap on the surface had usually shoved one into the open, which meant there were probably hundreds up there and maybe even more down below in the moss. And now that I had shrimplets, it was time to add something new to the tank. I'd never seen or heard of these guys before. I was just in a random fish shop looking at stuff and there they were. Apparently this tank is the exact minimum size recommended by a few different fish keeping websites. And I read they were notoriously difficult to feed because they only eat live food. So then I was like, only eats live food? Obviously I got 4 of them and poured them in. They're called Endostomus paradoxus, which means strange tiny mouth. And it's a lot less of a fancy name, but it's very fitting. They live in stagnant waters, eat tiny crustaceans, and only grow to about an inch in length. So I couldn't have been luckier coming across them when I did. They look and hunt like little crocodile things, just hovering in place all day waiting to snatch up anything that comes by. Honestly, they're so much fun to watch, but extremely hard to find because they just lurk in the shadows all day. In fact, they love to sit in the little cracks between rocks, so I wouldn't even see them for weeks at a time. I didn't want them eating the baby cherry shrimp, so I poured in some brine shrimp instead for them to fill up on. They definitely got excited, but unfortunately their mouths were too small to do anything about it. And Daphnia were too big as well. They spent their first few days hiding amongst the mosses, but eventually they started hanging around the front of the cave, picking off baby Daphnia and ostracods. Sometimes the Daphnia would even give them a hard time. The brine shrimp won't survive in fresh water, but they'll get eaten by the shrimp eventually when they float to the bottom. You can see the floating plants get more red the closer they are to the light, but the other plants needed some light as well, so I took most of them out, even though I like the way they look, because they're going to grow back eventually anyway. Another couple of weeks went by and I added 2 anchor catfish to the tank, though they didn't really do anything besides sit on the wood pretending to be bark all day. And they're so good at hiding I'd usually only see him maybe once a week. I tried to feed this one and he just seemed annoyed that I interrupted his busy day of doing nothing. I think I only ever saw him out in the open once, but I could finally see what they look like up close. So I just assumed they're nocturnal, which would explain why they love the cave so much. Sure enough, one night after dark, I shone a light on the tank and there they were, swimming around. They seemed to enjoy each other's company. In other news, the Endostomus were eating the smaller microfauna like the seed shrimp, but they weren't bothering with the copepods or even the Daphnia, which had started breeding out of control. the tank had been going for 4 months now, and I decided it needed a fish that actually looked like a fish. The sparkling gourami likes to hide, but only because it's a micro predator. He picked the biggest clump of moss in the middle of the tank and used it as his lair. If any Daphnia or tiny shrimp showed up, this guy would be waiting in the shadows nearby to pounce. Otherwise, he'd be prowling around looking for something to bully out of his territory. The shrimp babies were growing up, as evident by the shed exoskeletons all over the tank. And the gourami never went in the cave, so it acted as sort of a safe spawning ground for the mothers. You can see under the abdomen of the females where they hold their eggs. This is going to be the 3rd generation of shrimp, and after I counted 4 mothers with 30 eggs each, that's 120 eggs. When the shrimplets are born, they come out looking like this, and over a period of about 2 to 3 months they get slowly bigger and bigger until they're old enough to breed, and then the cycle starts all over again. This tank's been going for about 4 months, which is just long enough for the shrimp to have had babies, and for those babies to have grown up and had babies. I know 4 months isn't a long time, but I'd say it's long enough for a tank like this to really develop, tell a story, and reach some kind of equilibrium. In the end, the foam took up too much space, and I didn't end up moving the guppies across. The tank would have just been too small for them. But if I've learned anything, it's that you can actually do quite a lot with a tank this size, and it can look really good with basically no effort because nature's always going to take over. Though I'll probably just be using it as a shrimp factory going forwards. I'll just harvest a handful every now and then to sell, or to use for different tanks.